There is a plant in your garden right now that is doing more work this month, in the dark, than it will do all of next summer out in the sun. And you will never see a minute of it. Most folks think a plant runs on one clock. It does not. It runs on two. The leaves up top read the air and the shortening days. And right about now, they are starting to shut the shop for winter. But the roots down below cannot see the sky. They read only one thing, the temperature of the soil around them, and the soil is weeks behind the air. So for a stretch of about 6 to 10 weeks every fall, you get this strange, quiet gift. The top of the plant has eased off the gas, and the roots are still rolling. That gap is the whole secret. It is the reason a perennial you tuck into warm August soil can open up next May fuller and stronger than the very same plant set out in spring. Not because August is magic. Because you slipped it in during the one window when it can build the half of itself you never get to admire, with nothing else competing for its attention. Get this window right, and next spring your beds open up full instead of thin and patchy. Miss it, and you spend April watching bare twigs try to catch up. This is Golden Harvest, where the whole idea is simple enough to fit on a seed packet. Feed the soil, not the plant. Pull up a chair and let us talk this through like two old friends leaning on the same garden bed, because that is exactly what this is. Now, let me tell you what this list is not. It is not another 18 reasons to buy another bag of something. The single best thing you can do for these plants this month is free, and by the end, you will understand why nobody runs an advertisement for it. We are going to count down 18 perennials from 18 to 1, and I have ordered them on purpose. Worst risk at the top, safest bet at the bottom, so the list itself teaches you the rule. Number 6 is the one that stops people cold, because it flowers in the dead of winter when your whole yard is asleep. And number 1 is the most forgiving thing you will ever push into the ground. Stick with me, because the piece in the middle, the part almost nobody tells you, is the part that decides whether any of this actually lives. If a full spring with less bending and less guessing sounds good to you, go ahead and subscribe so the next one finds you. Let us start under the soil, because everything on this list runs on the same engine. Think of your plant as having two separate thermostats. One is up in the leaves, wired to the air and the length of the day. The other is down in the roots, wired only to the soil. And here is the piece that changes how you see your whole garden. Those two thermostats are set to different numbers. Roots do their best growing in cooler ground than the tops want for their best growing. Roots are happy working down in the 50s and into the low 60s. The tops want it warmer, up in the 60s and into the low 70s. So when the air cools first in the fall, the leaves get the memo and slow down, while the soil, which holds summer heat like a thick brick wall, holds the warmth of the afternoon, keeps the roots in their sweet spot for weeks longer. Now, let me keep myself honest here, because there is a tall tale mixed into this that I do not want to hand you. You will hear people say, roots grow faster in cool soil. They do not. As the ground cools, roots slow down, same as everything else. Truth be told, spring is actually the bigger root push of the year, not fall. So what is the real gift of planting now? It is not raw speed, it is peace. In August, there is no brutal summer sun cooking atop the roots cannot yet support. There is no transplant shock, because the plant is not trying to feed a full head of leaves. A small, new root system can easily keep up with a plant that is already slowing down for the year. It is the calmest possible time to ask a plant to move houses. That is the advantage. Not a magic growth spurt, a gentle landing. Now here is where feed the soil stops being a slogan and starts being a reason. While those roots are pushing out through warm August ground, they are not just getting longer, they are getting introduced. In an old bed, one you have fed with compost and not torn up every year, there is already a living network of fungus threaded through the soil, finer than any root, running plant to plant. Gardeners call it Mycorrhizae. Think of it as the soil's own grocery delivery service, reaching into corners a root could never go and hauling back water and nutrients in exchange for a little sugar. When a fresh root grows through that warm soil, the fungus threads into it. The plant plugs into the network. And here is the kicker that ties it all together. That handshake only happens when the soil is warm. The fungus does its introductions when the ground is above about 50 degrees. Let the soil slide down toward the mid-40s, and the whole thing stalls. The fungus does not die, mind you. It just stops shaking hands until spring. So August is not only the root window, it is the wiring window. Plant now, and your perennial goes into winter already connected, and wakes up in spring plugged into the grocery line. Plant that same thing next spring, and it spends its first cold months alone, standing in the yard, cold calling the neighbors it has not met yet. And this is the part where I have to tell you something the garden center would rather I skipped. In a living, well-fed bed, you do not need to buy a bottle of fungus to make this happen. You already own the network. The bottles on the shelf are mostly for dead dirt, bagged mix, freshly tilled ground where the network got wiped out. The move that actually works, planting into living soil while it is still warm, has no label, no barcode, and nobody to sponsor a video about it. There is nothing to sell you. That is not a conspiracy. It is just economics. The free thing stays invisible, because invisible is what free things do. Feed the soil, and the soil makes the introductions for you, for nothing. Now I owe you the other half of the truth, the half the plant everything in August crowd never mentions. Because there is a way for all of this to go wrong, and it has a name: frost heave. Picture bare ground in late winter. A warm spell, then a hard freeze, then another thaw, then another freeze. Each time the water in the soil freezes, it swells, and each time it thaws, it settles. The ground is breathing in and out, and a young plant that has not yet gripped down deep gets pumped upward on that breathing soil, a little each cycle, until one gray morning you walk out and find it sitting an inch proud of the bed, crown bare to the wind, its finest roots snapped clean. The Chicago Botanic Garden names the usual victims plainly: shallow-rooted plants like coral bells, foamflower, and sea thrift, along with anything set out so late its roots never took hold. And Cindy Haynes, an extension horticulturist at Iowa State University, puts it about as bluntly as it can be put. Most perennials planted or divided in late summer and early fall are candidates for heaving their very first winter. So this is the rule that runs through the whole list, the reason I ordered it the way I did. Root type is destiny. A plant with fine, wiry, fibrous roots grabs the soil like a fistful of thread and holds on through the freezing and thawing. A plant with a fat taproot or fleshy roots or a shallow crown sitting right at the surface, that is the one that gets pumped out. And you get two defenses, both free. First, the 6-week rule. Get everything into the ground at least 6 weeks before your soil freezes hard, so those roots have time to grip. Second, and this one is backwards from what most people do, your winter blanket of mulch goes on after the ground freezes, not before. Its job is not to keep the roots warm. Its job is to keep them evenly cold, so the soil stops that breathing in and out and stops pumping. That is a different thing from the thin layer of mulch you lay down at planting to hold moisture. 2 jobs, 2 timings. Get them straight, and Heave never touches you. A few plain habits carry every plant that follows, so let me say them once, and not repeat them 18 times. Dig wide, not deep. New roots run sideways, long before they head down. So a hole twice as wide as the pot, and no deeper, beats a narrow deep one every time. Set the crown, the spot where roots meet stems, right at the soil line. Bury a crown, and it tends to rot from the middle out. Skip the high nitrogen feed this time of year. You are trying to get roots to toughen up and harden off, and a shot of nitrogen pushes out soft new leaves that the first frost will simply blacken. Water deep and slow right after you plant, then ease off as the ground cools for good. And here is the one caution I will say a single time for the entire list, so please tuck it away. Check your local extension office and your USDA hardiness zone before you plant a thing. August in Georgia and August in Minnesota are 2 completely different deadlines, and only your own zone knows which one is yours. All right, let us get into the list, starting at the top with the ones that ask the most of you. Number 18, Russian sage. I am starting here on purpose, because this is the one plant on the list where I am going to argue against the very premise of the video, and I would rather be honest than tidy. Russian sage is a joy in a hot, dry, forgotten corner. Silver stems, hazy blue flowers, and deer walk right past that aromatic foliage, but it is really a woody little shrub, not a soft perennial, and a woody thing going into winter, only half-rooted, is exactly what frost and drying wind love to punish. So here is my honest read. If you garden somewhere mild, plant it now and enjoy it. But if your winters are hard, zone 5 and colder, this is the one I would hold for spring instead, and let it root through a long, warm season, rather than gamble it against the freeze. Lean soil, full sun, and do not feed it rich, or the stems flop. Knowing when not to plant something is its own kind of skill. Number 17. Baptisia, sometimes called false indigo. This one sends down a taproot like a young oak, and once that root is deep, the plant resents ever being moved again for the rest of its long life. Which is the whole reason to plant it now, while it is still small, and the soil is still warm. You are setting an anchor you will not get a second chance to reset, so you want it reaching down through soft, warm ground, not fighting cold clay. Give it full sun and a little patience. The first year it sulks, and you will wonder why you bothered. By the third year, it is a waist-high shrub covered in blue spikes, and it will outlive most things in your yard, including possibly the fence. Number 16. Oriental Poppy. If yours vanished back in July and you quietly mourned it, good news. That was not death, that was the plan. Right now it is nothing but a resting taproot underground, and dormant is the only stretch of the year when this plant forgives being planted or moved. Try it any other time and you set it back a full season. So this dormant August window is not just a nice option, it is the window. Full sun, sharp drainage, because sitting in wet winter ground will rot that root before spring ever arrives. And since the leaves disappear for weeks in summer, tuck something loose and sprawling beside it to cover the gap, and next spring you get blooms the size of your open hand, in colors so bold they look painted on. Number 15. Bleeding Heart, for the shady spot. And here is where I have to part ways with a lot of what floats around the internet. You will read that bleeding heart needs some exact number of weeks below some exact temperature to trigger its blooms, a very precise-sounding figure. I want to be straight with you. That is folklore wearing a lab coat. Somebody grabbed a real chilling threshold and bolted an invented stopwatch onto it. The honest truth is simpler and kinder. Bleeding heart is a tough, hardy perennial that goes to sleep in summer heat, and like most of our cold climate plants, just needs an ordinary winter to reset. No stopwatch required. Set the crown level with the soil in rich, moist shade, and plant ferns or hostas beside it to fill the summer gap. One real safety note, because I know who is watching. Every part of this plant is poisonous if it is eaten, and the sap can bother sensitive skin, so wear gloves and keep it well off the list of things little hands might taste. Number 14. Bearded Iris. And this plant has the strangest planting rule you will meet all day. It grows from a rhizome, a fat underground stem, and that rhizome wants to sit right at the surface, its back half exposed to the sun, like a potato you only half buried. Bury it the way you would a normal plant, and it simply rots. Late summer is when that rhizome is resting, which makes right now the classic time to plant it, or split an old clump. Lay it on a low mound of soil, spread the roots down each side like a saddle, and whatever you do, never pile mulch on its back. Trapped moisture there is the fastest way to lose it. Full sun and sharp drainage are not suggestions with this one, they are the whole game. Number 13. Peony. Fall has always been peony planting time, and one single number decides whether you get flowers or 40 years of leaves. The pink buds on the root, the ones gardeners call eyes, must sit no more than 1 to 2 inches below the surface. Plant them deeper, even by a couple of inches, and you can get a gorgeous, healthy plant that never blooms, not once. Full sun, rich soil, and skip the high nitrogen, which pushes leaves at the expense of flowers. That is the short version. We have a whole video on peonies here on Golden Harvest if you want to go deeper, but plant those eyes shallow and you are most of the way home. Number 12. Siberian Iris, the easygoing cousin of the one we just met. Where the bearded iris is fussy about that exposed rhizome and hates wet feet, the Siberian iris is the forgiving one. It clumps up from fine, fibrous roots, it shrugs off damp ground, it resists disease, and it will happily settle into that soggy spot by the downspout, where a bearded iris would sulk and rot. Plant the clump now, water it in, and those fibrous roots knit a mat that laughs at frost heave all winter. Slender grassy leaves, elegant blue and purple flowers in late spring, and almost no fuss from you. This is the low drama choice, and some years low drama is exactly what a garden needs. Number 11. The daylily. Just about the toughest customer on this whole list. Late summer is a fine time to lift a tired old clump and split it into 3 or 4 new ones. Those thick, fibrous roots grab hold fast, which is exactly why an August division settles in with almost no complaint before winter. Full sun to part shade, ordinary soil, and it asks for very little. We have a full daylily video on the channel if you want the deep dive on getting more blooms out of them. But for today, just know this is one of the safest, most bulletproof things you can plant or divide this month. Number 10. Astilbe. Those feathery plumes of pink, red, and white that light up a damp, shady corner where nothing else wants to bloom. But I owe you an honest caveat with this one. Astilbe is a moisture lover with fairly shallow roots, and that combination puts it squarely on the Heave watch list its first winter. So 2 things. Never let it dry out while it is settling in, or it will brown at the leaf edges and tell on you fast. And remember our winter mulch rule, laid down after the ground freezes, then a walk out to check on it after any big thaw. Partial to full shade, rich soil kept evenly moist. Give it that, and it fills the quiet gap between the spring bulbs and the summer flowers with almost no other effort from you. Number 9. Coral bells. And I want you to really watch this one, because it teaches the entire lesson of this video in a single plant. Coral bells grow from a woody crown that sits right at the soil surface, with fine roots underneath. That shape, a crown perched on top and fine roots below, is precisely the shape frost heave was built to lift. The Chicago Botanic Garden puts coral bells near the very top of its heaving list, right there with foam flower. So yes, plant it now for the head start. The foliage alone is worth it. Amber and purple and near black, holding color 3 seasons a year. But this is the plant that makes our winter mulch rule non-negotiable. And this is the plant you walk out to check after every hard freeze and thaw. If you find it sitting up proud with a little gap of air under the crown, do not stomp it back down. You will only snap those fine roots. Instead, lay fresh soil gently over the exposed crown and firm it in with your hand. Do that faithfully through the first winter, and coral bells rewards you for years. Ignore it, and it is the first plant you will lose. Same plant, same August. The only difference is whether you understood what was happening underground. Number 8. Creeping phlox, the one people tuck into a single lonely pot when it wants to be a carpet. It spreads by rooting as it runs, so planting now gives every stem months to stitch itself into a solid mat before spring. Give it full sun and lean, rocky, dry ground, because it actually struggles in rich, wet soil. And a trick that pays off: space the little plants in a staggered pattern rather than a straight line, and they knit together noticeably faster. One caution: since it roots shallow, it belongs on the same heave watch as coral bells, so mulch it after the freeze. Do that, and by April you can have a sheet of pink and purple and white pouring over ground that would otherwise still be bare. Number 7. Brunera, also called Siberian bugloss, and this is your quiet revenge if the deer and rabbits treat your hostas like an open salad bar. Its rough, heart-shaped leaves are exactly the texture-browsing animals refuse to touch, so while the hostas next door get chewed to nubs, this one stands untouched, throwing up clouds of tiny sky-blue flowers that seem to float above the foliage in spring. It settles into shade on fibrous roots that grip before the cold, which keeps it off the worst of the heave list. Give it partial to full shade and steady moisture. Mulch to hold that moisture through the last hot stretch, and it brings life back to the darkest, most difficult corner of the yard. Number 6. The hellebore, also called the Lenten rose, and this is the one that stops people in their tracks. Here is why I saved it for the surprise slot. While your entire garden is fast asleep in the dead of late winter, snow sometimes still on the ground, the hellebore is blooming. Blooming. It is evergreen. The deer leave it alone. It lives for decades, and it flowers at the exact moment nothing else in your yard dares to. The one catch: it truly hates being moved once it has settled. So the spot you choose this August is the spot for the next 10 years. Choose it like you mean it. Plant it under a deciduous tree, where summer leaves shade it and winter bareness lets the light reach its evergreen foliage. Dig the hole wide, disturb the roots as little as you can, and space them a foot to 2 feet apart so damp spring air can move between them. Get this one right in the warm days of August, and you have bought yourself a flower in February, when a bloom is worth more than at any other time of the year. Number 5. Yarrow. And from here to the finish, we are in the plants that make August planting close to foolproof, because every one of them is a fine, fibrous rooted grabber that shrugs off Heave. Yarrow flat-out thrives on neglect, lean soil, full sun, and real drought tolerance once it is settled. Ferny gray-green foliage, flat-topped flower heads that the pollinators mob from morning to night, and those fibrous roots dig in fast and hold tight through the worst of a freezing and thawing winter. If you have a hot bright spot and a habit of forgetting to water, this plant was practically made to forgive you. Number 4. Perennial salvia. Spikes of deep blue and violet, one of the longest bloom runs of anything in the border, and a fibrous root system that settles in quick and quiet from an August planting. Full sun and well-drained soil are all it really asks. Here is the habit that doubles your flowers. When that first flush starts to fade, shear the whole plant back by about 1/3, and it pushes out a fresh round within a couple of weeks. Bees work it all day, and hummingbirds check it on their way through. Reliable, generous, and almost impossible to get wrong. Number 3. The Shasta daisy. That clean, cheerful white flower with the sunny center that everybody recognizes, and one of the very fastest to establish from an August start. Full sun, decent drainage, and those fibrous roots will have knit a full rounded clump by the time spring arrives, wide enough to divide into new plants within a year or two. That is the quiet magic of planting a fibrous rooted perennial now. Instead of in spring, you skip the whole first year of it looking like a sad little transplant. Divide it every few years to keep it vigorous, and it will hand you armfuls of cutting flowers for the kitchen table. Number 2. Sedum, the variety often sold as autumn joy, and if you want the closest thing to a guarantee on this entire list, this is it. Fibrous, tough, and so drought-proof it practically stores its own water in those fat leaves. And it does something none of the others on the list can do. It blooms in fall, right now, which means an August planting can hand you flowers this very season. Dusty rose flower heads that then dry to a deep bronze and stand up straight right through the snow, holding seed for the birds all winter. Lean soil, full sun, hardly any way to fail. If you have talked yourself into believing you have a brown thumb, plant this one and let it quietly prove you wrong. And number 1, the plant I have been building toward the whole way down, catmint. I saved it for last because it is the single most forgiving thing you will put in the ground this month, and because it shows off everything we have talked about, all at once. Fine, fibrous roots that grab warm August soil and simply never let go, so frost heave never gets a grip on it. Aromatic foliage, so the deer and rabbits leave it be. Real drought toughness once it is in. All it asks is full sun and soil that drains, because soggy roots are about the only thing that can bother it. Space the plants 1.5 to 2 feet apart so they can mound out. And here is the payoff that is really the whole thesis of this video. Standing in one plant. You push this unremarkable little thing into warm ground this month and walk away. And by the first warm days of spring, you have a rounded cloud of silver and soft purple, humming with bees, looking for all the world like it has been settled there for years, while the neighbor who waited for spring to plant the very same catmint is still standing over a bare little twig, wondering why yours is so far ahead. It is not luck. It is the 2 thermostats. It is the handshake in the warm soil. It is the work you could not see, done now, in the warm dark, paying you back in May. Now here is where I want to hear from you, because the folks reading these comments learn as much from each other as they do from me. Tell me this. What is the one perennial your family always swore had to go in during spring, the rule you inherited and simply never questioned? Drop it in the comments and put your growing zone right next to it, because somebody gardening in your exact winter is reading this right now, and your note might just save their coral bells. And if you have got a plant that heaves itself out of the ground every single winter no matter what you try, name it down there and let us troubleshoot it together as a group. I read them, and so do a lot of very sharp gardeners. The thing I keep coming back to, after all these years with my hands in the dirt, is that planting in August is really an act of trust. You take something small, you set it into warm, dark soil where you cannot watch it, and you walk away. And all through the cold months, out of sight, below the frost line, that little plant is quietly building the entire half of itself you will never lay eyes on. Gripping down, wiring into the living soil, getting ready. You do not get to supervise it. You just have to believe the quiet work is worth doing. And then one morning in May, the bed opens up full and green, instead of thin and bare, and you understand that it was. If that is the kind of gardening you love, the kind that works with the soil instead of against it, then you already know what to do. Subscribe, and I will see you out at the next garden bed. This has been Golden Harvest. Feed the soil, and the soil will feed everything else.